We will start our meeting now. So in this workshop, we are going to explore this theme of consciousness. And the most basic statement of Krishnaji about consciousness is that the consciousness is made up of its contents. And without the contents, there is no consciousness as we know it. So probably we can begin with this statement, and through exploring that statement, maybe we will come upon other aspects of which are related to this consciousness. Now, what is the content of our consciousness? So that is mostly the memory, which is thought, ideas, experiences, images, and also the psychological content, which we call as fear, pleasure, and all those things. So all that together is the content of our consciousness. But how does it happen? I mean, how does the content get formed? I think it may be interesting to start from the scratch and try to find out how it may be getting formed. So in our attempt to visualize, suppose the first living entity who came into existence. That means we say that matter is inanimate. That means there is no life in matter, in the sense that the stone is a stone, rock is a rock. There doesn't seem to be any consciousness in it. But whatever may be the first living entity, right, that living entity receiving input from the environment, and that input creating some change within that living entity. Now that change is nothing but a kind of sensation, a thrill, which is just vaguely felt. And maybe that is the first experience of being conscious. So naturally, at that primitive stage, the sensitivity may be almost zero. There are no specialized organs to receive the input, so maybe only through contact the input is felt. And then the impact from the environment should be very intense, should be very enormous, because the sensitivity is almost nil. Therefore, to create that quiver, to create that, although even a faint sensation, a tremendous external impact may be required. And then that impact creating that vague feeling, that vague sensation, which creates a feeling of being alive, being awake. So it must have begun from there. And I think through the passage of time, the time scale is also very huge, maybe millions of years. And in that, then slowly, as the consciousness became clearer and clearer, so it needed more complicated forms to express itself through. And so this whole activity of evolution, the biological evolution, It must have started like that. And through the evolution, as the consciousness became more and more varied, it needed the corresponding living forms, that is corresponding physical body, to express itself. So the physical body also started getting more and more complicated. And then at certain stage, the specialized organs which can receive specialized inputs, they got developed, and also the sensitivity of the living entity also grew, so that it did not require those tremendous external impacts to generate sensation within itself, and so on. So that change within could be regarded as the first primitive expression of consciousness, where the entity is feeling alive. It is feeling that something exists, or it exists. And then that first input also leaving some mark, some residue within that entity. So that residue became the memory of that living entity. And so different kinds of impacts creating different kinds of memory, and then from that different kinds of memories, the living entity responding to the environment, right? So the experience of feeling alive also started getting enriched because of the varied external inputs, creating varied internal sensations, and experiencing those sensations, this feeling of being alive. And initially it must have been only the internal sensations of which the entity was awake. But as it became capable of moving or movement, it started moving towards those inputs which were giving it the sensation of being alive. And therefore, slowly it was able to correlate the external object with the corresponding input, giving a corresponding sensation. So once the inner sensation, the entity was able to connect with the outer object via the input it has received from that object, then it became conscious of the external object. So initially it was conscious only of what was the sensation within, but that sensation correlated with the external object, so it became conscious of the external object. And so we can say that the consciousness of that entity got externalized, and then it started functioning with the external objects, and if that external object is enhancing its sense of being alive, then it started moving towards those objects. And if the external object is dangerous to its sense of existence, then it started moving away from it. So in a very primitive way. So once the consciousness is externalized, then it was mostly caught up in the external thing. So started living its life in the external world, and then the evolution went on and on and on. So through the interaction with the external environment, it is all the time building up its memory, which is its database, and from that responding to the environment. So that kept on happening like that until the animal kingdom. And when it came to human stage, then there was an addition of a completely different faculty, the faculty of thinking. That means a living entity became capable of thinking, and that made the whole difference, because with the thinking capacity, the human beings were able to survive better compared to other animals. Their experience of life became even more varied, more intense, clearer, more vivid rather. And we as human beings started living that life. But another big change that happened because of this thinking capacity was the enormous amount of the content of consciousness. Because until the animal kingdom, the content of consciousness is generated only through the direct interaction with the environment. That means whatever input is received from the environment, corresponding to that input, the experience, corresponding to that experience, the residue of that experience, which is the memory, and that memory becomes the content of consciousness. So until animal kingdom, the content of consciousness is generated only through the direct interaction with the environment. But when we come to human stage, then along with that direct interaction with the environment, the human beings through their thinking capacity are able to generate far more content of consciousness than what they are able to receive actually from the environment. So this is a turning point, because through the thinking activity, the content of consciousness generated is so huge, so large, that the content received directly through the interaction with the environment becomes negligible. It isn't comparable to the content generated by the thinking activity of the human being. So this leads us to the next statement of Krishnaji, which says that the content of consciousness is put together by thought. So which means that most of the content of our consciousness is put together by thought, and only very little content is obtained directly through the interaction with the environment. So this is also interesting, because once Krishnaji was asked this question, that sir, you are talking only about human consciousness, but what about animal consciousness, what about plant consciousness, what about the consciousness of different living entities? So are they different than the human consciousness? He said no, all the consciousness is one and the same consciousness, but the content, if we say that the consciousness is made up of its content, then the contribution of the content by the other living forms is very negligible compared to the contribution of the content by human beings. That means most of the content of consciousness is the contribution by human beings, and very small portion of it belongs to the other living entities. And therefore he is mostly talking about the human consciousness, because the content is contributed by human beings through their thinking activities. So consciousness is made up of its content, and the content is put together by thought, the thinking activity. Now, why does he say that the consciousness is made up of its content? Because if we consider being conscious as having that sense of existence, having that feeling that I exist or I am there. Right? So that feeling we are able to get only through that content. If we remove the content, then we don't know whether we are alive or dead. In fact, we have no feelings, we have no sense of existence without the content. I mean, a person, say, who is unable to think, who is unable to carry out any activity related to consciousness, he doesn't have that sense of being alive. Like a person in coma, although the body is alive, but psychologically he is dead because there is no corresponding activity. So that famous French philosopher Descartes, who made a statement that I think therefore I am, which only points out that we are conscious of our existence only through our thinking activity, only through our content of consciousness. And therefore, if the content is removed, then we are not conscious at all. So we are as good as dead. So the more varied the content, the more varied is our living experience. And thought is able to create any kind of content of consciousness. And through that content, we experience those corresponding sensations and then corresponding feeling of living through that activity. So thinking activity not only with respect to the external environment, but thinking activity within. That means you may be just sitting all by yourself and thinking about various things, and through that thinking activity experiencing, having that sense of existence through those through that thinking activity. So sometimes we call it as dreaming. So we not only dream during sleep, but we also dream when we are awake, and that dreaming corresponds to this thinking at getting absorbed into this thinking activity and experiencing whatever sensations produced by that thinking activity. So in that sense, we are able to be conscious only through the content of the consciousness. And if this content is removed, then we are not conscious at all. And the content being put together by thought, and the capacity of thought to generate this content is tremendous. In fact, this whole technological movement, which is nothing but an activity of accumulating more and more knowledge about things and storing that knowledge in the brain or wherever, even outside the brain, like some artificial devices, you can store that knowledge, that information, and then use it. So gathering of knowledge, storing it, and then using that stored knowledge to interact with the environment, to manipulate things. So that activity is constantly going on, and there is no limit to that activity in the sense that it can just go on without stopping. and more knowledge getting added. So that activity will go on. But then problem is with the knowledge, because all knowledge is not a useful kind of knowledge, in the sense that whatever the technological knowledge is useful because it can help you in interacting with the environment and getting the desired result or desired effect. But the other kind of knowledge, which we call as the psychological knowledge, which is not much useful in day-to-day activities, but it can create hindrances in our day-to-day activities. And if we find the contribution of psychological knowledge to the content of consciousness, then we find that it is much more than the technological knowledge. Because most of the human beings, they are constantly generating this psychological knowledge and storing it in their brain. While technological knowledge is, although it is also generated, but most of the time it is stored in various devices, not so much in the brain. And then it is accessed by the brain whenever it requires it through those, from those various devices. But the psychological knowledge is constantly getting stored in the brain cells. And so most of the content of our consciousness is made up of this psychological knowledge, the psychological experiences, and so on. And then that knowledge is not much useful in carrying out day-to-day activities. But it also prevents us from responding to the problems in a right way. Because psychological knowledge can not only limit our response to the external challenge, but it can also generate a wrong kind of response. A response which, instead of meeting the challenge, may aggravate it, or facing one challenge, it may generate another challenge, and so on. So that is the content of consciousness, which is really problematic. The technological content is all right. It is useful. But then the psychological content is also controlling the technological content. Because what kind of technological content a human being will generate will be decided by the psychological content. Then in what way the technological content will be used is also decided by the psychological content. And the psychological content being what it is going to use the technological content in a destructive way. Because human beings function according to their own self-interests. And the self-interest is always divisive. because it is always my interest against your interest or against anybody else's interest. And so there is always a conflict. And in that conflict, the psychological content is likely to use the technological content to settle the scores or to achieve its self-interested goal. So that is where the danger is. Also, the psychological content, it divides. It is me versus the rest of the human beings or rest of the things. And me is always having the highest priority. So me first and then everything else later. So because of this, the very approach of the thinker is divisive, because it thinks only in terms of division, and therefore whatever its activity based on its divisive thinking generates conflict, and then the conflict leading to finally suffering. So this is how the human consciousness seems to function. Although the content gives us a sense of being alive, the psychological content is generating suffering. So we are alive, no doubt, but we are suffering. But if all this content is taken away, then I am not even alive. So better to suffer and be alive rather than not being alive. That seems to be our position or our condition. So we don't mind getting angry, we don't mind suffering, we don't mind all the things that are happening to us psychologically. Because if they are taken away, we say that existence with suffering is preferable compared to no existence and no suffering. So for us, being alive amounts to being psychologically active, generating psychological content and going through all the psychological experiences. So though we suffer, we say that, but that is the way, that is how the life is, and we have to just adjust with it. And then if suffering is too intense, then we resort to different means to make it bearable and then continue. And if human beings continue like this, then they can continue like this ad infinitum. That means they can continue like this indefinitely. So life can go on like that. But then in that way, there are always possibilities of human being destroying themselves. And because of those possibilities, the human beings cannot continue indefinitely like this. Because at some point, they may either destroy themselves or they can just lose the capacity of their brain So this is where a situation where the humanity is stuck, in the sense that there doesn't seem to be any different future if human beings continue to live like this. They will just continue the way they are, suffering, uh, in conflict, and then the possibility of self-extinction hanging over their heads constantly, because the danger of using their own weapons to destroy themselves, that danger is very much real. It exists all the time as long as weapons are there. So that is where the question, is this all that is there to human life? And if we consider the biological evolution, has the evolution reached its culmination at this point? Because if the evolution means generating more and more content of consciousness, then at human stage, the human beings have the highest capacity to generate this content of consciousness, and they can keep on adding to it, and this process of adding is also indefinite. It can go on. So there is no further evolution in that direction. Nothing new can come about through that process, through that activity. And that is why this question, whether there is a other dimension to human existence, that means to have that sense of being alive, is that sense possible only through the contents of consciousness, or whether one can have that sense of being alive even without the content of consciousness? That is the important question. Because if we are alive only through the content of consciousness, then the kind of content we are having, that content doesn't give us any kind of security. It may give a temporary security, but if we look in long terms, there is no security at all. And the brain which is not secured, both physically and psychologically, cannot function properly. So then this question inevitably arises, because the content of consciousness, although it makes us feel alive, is also leading us in the direction of self-extinction, which is quite a contradictory process. That is why the question whether the sense of existence, sense of being alive, whether it is possible to get that without the need for this content of consciousness. I think that is an important question. So maybe at this point I stop, and the questions, whatever has been said, I think some of it you may find abstract. So I think it is better we have questions and then clarify things, so that when we again begin with that important question, we are already clear about whatever we have explored. So I think we can have questions now.
Sir, a small child,
Yeah,
a baby,
yeah,
also has the sense of being alive,
yes.
but the content of consciousness, what is the state of its content?
Yeah, it also has the same content of consciousness as anybody else has. Only thing is that it is in a dormant state, in the sense that as it interacts with its environment, then that content becomes manifest. And as it grows, then more and more content starts manifesting. And then we can start seeing the nature, the mind of that child. Because all children at a very young age, they are almost similar. They are innocent, they are very nice to look at, to play with, and all those things. But as they grow, during that growth, the content of their consciousness starts getting manifested. And it will manifest according to their environment, whatever environment they are living in and interacting with that environment. So through that interaction, that dormant content starts manifesting, and then we start seeing the child as it is psychologically. So you can see the same content operating there also. A child playing with a toy, if you take away his toy, then he doesn't like it, he reacts. Or if you are more affectionate to a particular child, then the other child may feel jealous. Then there are also fears and so many things. So actually, they have the same content of consciousness. And depending upon the environment they are living in, the corresponding content will start manifesting. So that is why the great importance of what kind of environment you are providing to these children. Because according to that environment, uh, the content of their consciousness will start manifesting. Yeah. So
Sir.
yeah, so in that environment, we are not only talking of the external environment, but also the environment, the psychological environment, which parents are creating through their psychological activity. So if there is a sense of insecurity in parents, if there is fear in the parents, right, then those psychological aspects, they are going to affect the child also. So it is not just the external environment, which is having nice house or clean this thing and all those things, or behaving with the child in a nice way, but also what actually goes on in the minds of the parents, their psychological makeup, their psychological activity. So that psychological activity is going to generate the psychological environment around those children. And that psychological environment is equally uh, strong, equally important, because that is going to affect the child. So if parents are feeling insecure, then they are going to transmit that sense of insecurity psychologically to their children also. If there is fear in them, then they are going to transmit that fear to their children also. Now, this aspect is mostly not realized by people because they think that their consciousness is their private thing. So within themselves, whatever they do, it doesn't matter. Only externally, they should be okay, they should be nice. And inwardly, they may be thinking anything. So that probably is not correct. They don't realize that.
May I come in, sir?
Yeah, please.
Yes, sir.
By knowing about this content of consciousness,
Yes.
how it is useful to me in the application of it. This knowledge, how it is useful to me. This is the first question.
Yeah.
Second question is very small one. Like, can I call these beliefs, comparisons? They are also as content of consciousness.
Yes.
That's also.
Thank you. Yes. The second part of the question is, yes, the belief and all those things is also very much content of consciousness. All kinds of beliefs, faiths, ideologies, right? And in any kind of concept, thoughts, everything is the content of consciousness. Right? Now, you are saying that how the knowledge of the content of consciousness is useful. Now, knowledge is useful. The technological knowledge is certainly useful to carry out the day-to-day activities. But the psychological knowledge.
No. I'm not talking about that, sir.
Yes.
The lecture you gave today about what is consciousness and all that.
Yes.
How it is useful to me.
Okay.
Where it is useful to me.
Okay. So whatever we have talked so far, in what way it is useful to me? Now, what use do I want to make out of this? Do I want to use it in some way or other? Or I don't know where to use it and how to use it. Right? Now, what is the use if this is only a knowledge, right? Then that knowledge is either useful to you or not useful to you, because it depends on what you want to achieve, what are your goals, and so on. And you may find that this knowledge may not be useful in whatever you want to achieve. So you may say, okay, this is all waste of time. There is no point in getting this kind of knowledge because it doesn't serve any purpose. Right? But other thing is that if I want to live in the kind of environment I am put in, or whatever way I am living, right? Now, whatever that I do, my action, is it only a result of the external environment, or it is a combination of what goes on within me and what goes on outside me? Now, if you say that it is only the external environment, then probably this will have no use. Because if a person says that whatever my responses are, those responses are completely the result of external environment, right? Then I have to only address the external environment. Then the consciousness, its content, and all those things, they have no value, no importance, because everything is happening externally, right? And therefore, I have to only address the external, forgetting about the internal. Now, if a person takes that kind of stand, then he is already limiting himself in certain way, and also he is assuming that everything is only due to external and internal has no role to play in it. Now, that kind of assumption could be totally wrong, because it is unverified assumption. And just because we assume something doesn't mean that the things will happen according to our assumptions. we must check the facts. If we want to understand the things, then we have to be factual. We must go by facts and not just by our assumptions, which are as per our likes and dislikes and as per our limitations, as per our motives and interests. Because the nature doesn't function according to our motives and interests. So, if whatever that happens is a combined result of the external happenings and also whatever goes on within us, right? Then whatever goes on within us is also equally important to understand. So as we try to understand what is happening outside, we have to also understand what is happening inside. Because unless we understand that, we won't be able to find out in what way it is affecting the external happening. And that is why if we want to learn about what is happening within us, then we have to observe it. We have to learn about it. And that is why this consciousness and the content of consciousness, that becomes necessary to understand all that movement. Because the movement inside is the movement of what we call as consciousness, which is made up of its content. So the movement of the content of this consciousness is the movement within. And without understanding that movement within, you cannot face the movement which is without, which is outside. So you have to observe in what way the movement within is going to affect or is affecting the movement outside. Only then you will be able to come upon the correct action vis-a-vis what is happening. So therefore it is important, because the same given environment draws different responses from different individuals. Now if everything is going to happen only externally or only according to the external environment, then given the external environment, the response of each individual should be the same, because there is no role for what is happening within an individual. We are saying everything is by external. So if external is going to decide everything, then given the external environment, every human being should respond in the same way. But the actual observation is not like that. Suppose there is a provocative environment outside, the environment is such that it is highly provocative, then all the human beings are not getting provoked. Some will get provoked, some will not get provoked. Some people will get angry, some will not get angry. So why this different response if everything is decided by the external? So which means that our assumption is not correct. There is a contribution from what is happening inside, the inner, and maybe the event is a combination of external happening and the inner response coming together, creating that event. And therefore it becomes necessary that a human being should understand himself, what he is psychologically, because his psychological makeup is going to decide his behavior, his responses to the external. So I hope I have answered this question.
Thank you so much, sir.
May I ask you some question?
Yeah, please.
Ah, uh, I know about some terms. Can you explain what does it mean?
Yeah,
Like, for example, subconscious, collective consciousness, super
yes,
consciousness.
yes.
What is the difference in that?
Yeah, actually, we have not used any of those terms so far. We have just, in a, basically, we are just discussing about what is consciousness and what are its contents and how they are
Okay.
affecting. So just first three basic statements of Krishnaji, that consciousness is made up of its content. The content is put together by thought. So these are the statements which we are exploring, but eventually we are going to come to the questions which we have raised. That
Okay.
is the subconscious, unconscious,
Okay.
and the
Okay.
commonality of consciousness and so on. So
Okay.
we are going to come upon that, and whether there is any such thing as super consciousness and so on. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Sir, may I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Okay, this content of consciousness, the way I see it, that content of consciousness gives me a sense of being alive.
Yes.
And to get that sense of being alive, more and more content of consciousness, I use my thinking machinery, more and
Yeah,
more
yeah,
content of consciousness.
yeah.
And now the same content of consciousness called suffering. So content of consciousness give me sense of being alive, and content of consciousness suffering. So the topmost issue, the reason I'm sitting in this is all suffering. That is the main issue, suffering,
Yeah.
and that suffering is real. So
Yeah.
that is the issue, suffering.
Right.
Now, as you see the content, that is because of content, suffering happens. That I can also see very much in my what is happening inside. So it sounds to me what you are making a statement or saying is, okay, as long as the content is there, suffering is there. So my question is, there's so much content and all. Is it there is a situation? Content is there, huge content means huge. Content is there, sense of being alive is also there, and
Yes.
suffering is not.
Yes.
So is there anything like this? The content and in term, whatever, I don't know. Content are there. And
Yeah.
as
No.
you say, the child has a content.
Yeah, what we are saying is that the psychological content is very much there. It is not only very much there, but it is being constantly added to. Because as we are living our life, day-to-day life, we are adding more and more psychological content to our consciousness. So we are generating more fear, more sense of insecurity, more conflict, being competitive, and all those things. So it is being constantly added to. And in that addition, we are feeling that we are alive. In that activity of adding psychological content, so through that activity, we feel that we are alive. I think, therefore I am. So if we are being alive through that activity, then naturally that activity will continue, it will go on. But then that activity is also creating suffering, leading to suffering. And that suffering, as long as it is within endurable limits, we don't mind suffering. We may continue, we may accept it as the inevitable way of life, and somehow we can go on. But only when it becomes acute, just crossing our threshold, then we actually start questioning that isn't there a way to live without suffering? Or is suffering that inevitable? Or can there be not a way of living which doesn't lead to suffering? So that question will inevitably come up. even though we may be putting up with the suffering and somehow carrying on with our life, but at some point of time, this question will inevitably come up, that isn't there a way of living without suffering?
Sir, I have a few questions before.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I could follow your point that consciousness is made up of its content
Yeah,
to some extent, but
yeah.
what I'm trying to understand is why does self-consciousness happen in the process of object consciousness?
Okay.
So that is my first question, sir.
So, how will you differentiate object consciousness from self-consciousness? That means we are conscious of the object, but why are we
Yes.
conscious of the object as the self? You see, probably up
Yes, sir.
to animal stage, there is only object consciousness.
Yeah.
In the sense that they just they have no such they are not self-conscious entities in that sense.
Yeah.
But still they may have some seeds of that self-consciousness, in the sense that whenever it comes to their survival,
Yeah.
then they may become self-conscious. For example, the animals, when they are eating, so they don't like to be disturbed while they are eating. And if they are disturbed, then they immediately become conscious of that and they attack the disturbing entity. Or even in
Yeah.
terms of propagation,
Yeah.
right, the sex and so on. So there again, we see a lot of violence or a lot of aggression in animals.
Yeah.
So in that sense, they become self-conscious. But in case of human beings, maybe this thinking capacity, this thinking activity may be responsible for this self-consciousness. Uh, because through thinking, the human beings are able to generate more and more content of consciousness, and therefore their experience of being conscious, being alive, is expanding in that sense. And so through this activity, maybe they are becoming self-conscious, because whatever that enhances their sense of being alive is preferred, is supported, and whatever reduces it is not accepted. So we try to move away from it. And through that, maybe this uh, everything being weighed in terms of how much it makes them feel secured or how much it enhances their sense of living. So there is
Yeah.
this identification process. So the experience doesn't remain just an experience, but that experience is being identified with by the thinker. And then that is generating a psychological content. For example, you look at something, and looking at something is becoming objectively conscious. But then the subjective element comes when you say that, yes, I like this, or how beautiful it is, or I want more of it. So once that kind of thing happens, then it is no longer objective consciousness, it becomes a subjective experience. And then according to that subject, the reaction or the response of the person that happens.
Okay. So when you say that, or when K says that consciousness is its content,
Yeah,
now I'm listening one other layer to it, that
yeah,
It is not the consciousness of the external object, but rather of its own content.
Yes,
Okay. Okay. So that was
that's right. Because corresponding to the external object, there is the internal image.
uh,
Because whatever input we have received from the external, that input has generated images within of that. And then what the brain is doing, brain is simply processing those images, right? And then if the brain wants to act vis-a-vis the external object, then it will act because it has the, you can say, the system of acting with the external objects. Like we have hands, we have legs, and we have generated so many machines with which we can just do whatever we want to do with the external object, right? But the processing is the processing of the image which we have received inside the brain. Because you see, actually from our 5 sensory organs, we are constantly receiving input from the external.
yeah.
And that input is constantly generating images. And those images are processed by the brain. They are compared, then they are labeled, and then they are stored. And according to label, the other images get associated with it, and so on. So all that brain activity constantly goes on. And then based on that processing, the brain will respond if it wants to respond to the external. Right? So to give an example, suppose you look at a chair, then the image of the chair is formed in the brain, right? So that is stored, that is recognized as a chair, and so on. Then if brain is interested, it may observe further and collect more details of that chair and all these things. Then after collecting all those chairs, the brain will further process it and may say that, okay, that chair is no good. If it is made of this material, then it will be better. If it is of this shape, then that is much better. Or if it has to be designed in such a way, then it will be more comfortable, and so on. So giving all those inputs, the brain will create its own image of the chair, which he says that is better than that chair, which is externally existing. Now, once that image is formed, then it is up to the brain whether it wants to create the actual object called chair according to its image or whether it doesn't. Suppose it has a resources and it has motivation, then it may end up in creating that chair. So the internal activity has created the external object, just as the external object has created the internal image. And so this kind of interaction all the time goes on. That is what the technological movement of acquiring knowledge and then using it, right? But when it comes to the psychological, the same thing, the brain doing with psychological thing, then it is generating a same psychological response to a given external situation. Which means that if some person says this kind of thing to me, I must get angry. And then I must respond out of that anger. So this becomes then a kind of psychological programming. And so our psychological responses are also then they get fixed. And then corresponding to the external environment, we start responding in terms of those psychological reactions.
So out of this whole content of consciousness,
Yeah.
what is the linchpin, sir? What is the fundamental flaw where on which we are tripping over?
Fundamental lock we are tripping over. Can you explain
What
a
is the
little bit more? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, say for example, I have a image about the chair. I have an image about the car, etc., etc.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what is the fundamental notion, thought, belief, whatever we call, which is driving the whole machine and making it accumulate more and more? Uh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. What is the fundamental notion which is driving this accumulation? Yeah, that is it.
Okay,
Important.
okay, okay. Is it the sense of me or my existence that is driving this whole movement? Because after all, whatever I consider as myself, which is my experience, my knowledge, my memory, my possessions, everything, and then that is driving all my activity, not only vis-a-vis the external, but also the activities within me. So do we call it as the self-interest? The center we call as the me.
Yeah. So, yeah. So then that asks another question. That begs
Yeah,
another question.
yeah,
That let us say I do have an image of me as an independent self,
yeah,
but why has it that destructive tendency?
yeah,
And why is it more in some people and why is it not so much in some other people?
yeah. No,
Why do we have that?
yeah,
Yeah.
the variation in extent is not that much important in the psychological realm, right? Saying that he is less violent and he is more violent, it doesn't mean much, because whosoever is less violent now can become more violent than the other person in different circumstances, different situation. So its only thing is that the provocative environment may be different for different individuals, and if the person is put into an environment which is very provocative specifically to him, he will respond in the same intense, violent way. So less and more probably may not be valid in the psychological realm, right? Uh, but then, what is the other part of your question you were asking?
Yes, sir. Less and more does not matter
Yeah, yeah,
because depending on the circumstances,
yeah, yeah,
everybody will get
yeah,
triggered.
yeah, yeah.
But why does this sense of self in itself has such
Oh,
a
yeah, yeah, yeah,
destructive
yeah, yeah, that's right.
tendency?
Yeah. So I think that goes as per this natural instinct. The natural instinct is the instinct for survival. So in case of up to the animal stage, right, where there is no such entity called the self or the me, the survival is mostly the biological survival, and therefore the animal will do everything to protect itself and survive biologically. Right? But in case of human beings, there is also what is called as the psychological survival, because human being is not only a biological entity, but it is also very much a psychological entity in terms of whatever psychological content it has generated, whatever knowledge, information, the whole content of consciousness. Now that whole content of consciousness, the human beings consider as themselves. That means I consider myself as made up of this content of consciousness. And so for me, the survival of me is the survival of this content of consciousness, because that is what I consider as myself. I am the content of my consciousness. Therefore, my survival is the survival of content of consciousness. So anytime the content of consciousness is challenged, then it is considered as a threat to my survival. So if I am holding some image dear to my heart, and when that image is challenged, then I consider it as a threat to my existence, because my existence is through that image. Through that image, I consider myself as existing or whatever I am. And if that image is challenged, then that is a threat to me. And therefore, my response is according to that threat. So this is how I think we seem to function. So whatever that we have gathered psychologically, we have identified ourselves with that psychological content, and because of that identification, we consider ourselves as that psychological content, and therefore any contradiction or any challenge to that psychological content is challenge to me, and then I behave according to that challenge, right? So even in
May I come in, sir?
yeah,
Absolutely.
even in ordinary discussions, you see, even in the so-called dialogue meetings and discussions, right? The moment a person identifies himself with his opinion, with his view, right, he ends up in conflict with other participants who are questioning his views, who are questioning his. So there again, there is a conflict. Because of identification with that opinion or with that view, right, the challenge to that is as if challenge to my existence, and therefore the response comes from that. So it is quite obvious to see even in superficial circumstances. Yeah.
Yeah. Identification is at the root of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, my
One
question
last
is,
comment,
sir,
not a
Yeah.
question.
Please ask.
can I ask my question, please?
Yeah. Yeah. Ask Mr. Shankar. Yeah.
Yeah. Thinking creates thinker, they say,
Yeah.
JK says.
Yeah.
Can I connect this with this content of consciousness, sir? Because of the content of consciousness is self is created.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Is there a difference between being unconscious
Huh.
and ending the content of consciousness?
Huh.
And the third is sleep.
Yes. Quite an
Three
interesting
things.
question. Yeah. Yeah. Being unconscious is that the person is not in his senses. The brain is not functional anymore, and therefore he is unconscious, not able to respond consciously to anything that is happening around it. So the state of unconsciousness is the state where the brain is non-operational, brain is unable to function, or brain is temporarily incapacitated from functioning. I mean the conscious functioning of the brain. We are not saying the biological functioning, that is the bodily functions, they go on, but the activity which we call as the activity of consciousness, that is not happening. So that is the state of unconsciousness. But during the sleep, the activity of the consciousness, it continues. It is not a state of unconsciousness. It is very much conscious, right? But then that conscious activity is going on within the brain. So that's why we dream and the thinking goes on even during the sleep, because the activity of the brain, it continues even during the sleep. So the state of sleep is not state of unconsciousness. And then you are asking the state of the empty consciousness. So we haven't talked yet about emptying the content of consciousness. But I think as we explore further and we come to that stage, we'll talk more about it. But what we can say is that the state of empty consciousness is different than both these states. It is different from state of unconsciousness, and it is also different from the state of sleep. It is quite a different state. Now, what exactly it is, I think we will eventually discuss that when we come to that. Yeah. What is the second question?
Difference between awareness and being conscious.
Okay. I can give you the technical difference, but to have the actual feel, I think we are yet to come to that stage. The technical difference is this, that the consciousness always needs some content to be conscious, while awareness doesn't need any content to be aware. So these may be just the words. We may not have much actual sense out of these words. But I think when we come to the awareness, we'll be able to discuss this in more details.
Kishorji, namaste.
Yeah, namaste.
My question is like this.
Yeah.
Sir, you had told us that in the Rishikesh retreat that Krishnaji had a talk with the redwood trees.
Yes.
So I was just, on basis of what you've just spoken in the morning,
Yeah.
I'm asking, in the evolution of consciousness from the primitive stage
Yes.
to the present day consciousness of modern man,
Yeah.
would psychological death lead to the ability to connect or bridge to the consciousness of all life forms?
Yes, I think we haven't discussed psychological death as yet. Of course, we have discussed it in previous occasions. But what I would say that as long as we are functioning in the limited field of our self-centered consciousness, then we are unable to connect to the other living forms, the consciousness of other living forms, because we are mostly centered or tethered to what we call as the me, my self-interest. And according to that self-interest, I have already demarcated my field within which I will be functional. And whatever comes within that field, only about that I am concerned. So anything outside that field, I am not concerned. So in that sense, I am unable to connect the consciousness of other living entities or living forms. Right? So not only that, but I am unable to connect even to the consciousness of other human being if he falls outside my self-centered field. So mostly whatever comes within that field, only that I am able to connect and interact with. Whatever is outside that field, probably I don't feel any concern about it. So I don't even attempt to connect to that other person. So Krishnaji had no such self-center. Therefore, he was able to relate with everything around him. And so even when he was in forest, now a person like us, if we go to forest, we may enjoy for some time, but very soon we will get fed up with that life in the forest, because we will find nobody to talk, nobody to connect with, nobody to relate with, and all the time just looking at trees and birds, animals, and all those things. And then you can't do anything about them. So a person may get bored, get fed up with that, and may want to come back to the social life, where he can interact with other human beings and share a gossip and do all kinds of things. But for a person who is not self-centered, who is able to connect with any living form, so forest is not an isolated place. The forest is full of life. There are so many living things in the forest. So he is able to connect with all that. He is able to relate with all that. So he is not lonely in that sense. But he is living with all those living things around him. So that's the difference between them and us. The forest was always a welcome for saints, but it is not so much welcome for us. We are who are unable to live there like that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
May I ask you a question, sir?
Yeah, please.
Psychological consciousness is connected to thoughts, no? And the thoughts are connected to memories. That means the memories are connected to consciousness.
Yes.
Is it so?
Yeah.
Then even the animals have got the memories.
Yes.
Then is there any psychological thinking in that? Animals also.
No, animals usually don't think, they only respond from the memory, whatever the memory. But probably if we are defining thought as the response of memory, then in that sense the animals are also thinking. But the kind of thinking activity which human beings are capable of, which is more an intellectual activity, which is the logical, rational thinking, in the sense that using intellect to connect, to correlate, to speculate, all that is absent in animals. But a simple thinking in the form of response of memory, that is there. That is there, I think, almost in every living entity. Whosoever has a memory, right, then that memory will definitely respond. So, and that response of memory, if we are defining as thought, then in that sense, every living entity is capable of thinking. But the kind of thinking which human beings are capable of, which we call as the intellectual activity of human beings. Now that activity the other forms are not capable of, because they don't have that kind of thinking capacity.
That means animal consciousness will comes as an instinct. Only.
Yes, right. Instinct.
That can it seems to be like that only.
Yeah.
There is no importance in that.
Yeah.
At least we do not know whether they think or not.
Yeah, I think some of the animals who are, say, in association with human beings, they have some primitive thinking capacity, Like say some of the dogs, or they say even some of the dolphins and the horses, they sometimes they respond like human beings.
They may be
They may have some,
also.
but usually on the whole, the animals don't have that kind of
capacity.
intellectual.
At least human beings don't have the capacity to understand them.
Yeah. You may put it that way also.
Maybe we can say the ants also talk, but we cannot understand it.
That's
but
right.
Yes, they do talk, no? Because we see that they are doing something.
Yeah,
What is that something?
you know,
We are not able to analyze it.
That's right. No, that is what we are saying, that we are not able to connect with the consciousness of those other living forms. We are not able to connect with them because of our self-centered consciousness. That is the whole point.
At least we are not able to translate it, or we are not able to yet understand what it is.
Yeah.
Maybe they are having it, but we don't know.
No, maybe they are having it.
We only think that only human beings are developed like that, and animals are not, or the birds are not, or the creatures are not like that. But they must be having some sort of, I do not know what it is. What we call it as an instinct for that, maybe it can be also a supernatural thing, no?
No, I think that is stretching the thinking capacity outside its limit. Why should we think that animals may have supernatural capacities? In some sense,
we assume that they don't have.
Yeah, no, but we also assume that they have. So both the things are assumptions. So what we can say is that we can say that yes, probably we don't know. That's all.
So that is why basically we started that the animals don't have the capacity of consciousness, psychological consciousness.
Yeah, because we don't see.
Indirectly, we think now that the psychology is also connected to memory. And animals have the memory. Only in human beings that memory is converted to psychological consciousness, while as in animals or instinct, we don't consider that memory gets converted to psychological consciousness.
No, what we are saying is that the psychological content, whatever response it generates in a human being, right? We don't see
Base is
that kind of
memory.
response. Yeah, we don't see that kind of response in animals. That is what I am saying. So the way the human beings give continuity to their experience, the way human beings give continuity to their suffering and so on, the way they generate experiences through their thinking activity, the animals don't seem to do that. So, and it is also possible to map the brain activity of the animals, which can show whether there is the thinking activity in them, just as it is there, as it is there in human beings. Yeah.
Maybe after some years, maybe we will have some equipment. It will try
No, we already have.
Brain power.
No, we already have, and I think some people may have done some research also in that. One has to just explore and find out. We already have equipment to map the brains of anything, human brain, animal brain, anything.
Okay, seems to be a complicated issue.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So we'll be.
Kishorji.
Yeah, you can ask us, Neha. You ask.
Yeah. So I think Annapurna auntie, or in the chat, the question is, Krishnaji said consciousness as we understand is made up of its content.
Yeah.
Does it mean there is a consciousness that we do not understand?
Yes.
And Kishorji, I want to add one small aspect before you answer that, Kishorji. Is that when you said we have a common consciousness, but we are constantly adding content with our consciousness, that means there is a group or pile of consciousness that is already there, and we just keep adding by our own experiences.
Yes.
But maybe I'll just leave it there, and it's an exploratory question. So.
Yeah. No, it's a very interesting question, because that is the aspect which we are going to discuss next. Whether the consciousness of each individual is a separate, isolated entity, or whether the consciousness of all human beings together makes up the consciousness of the totality of the consciousness of humanity. And then in what way it is connected, and what are the evidences which indicate that possibility, and so on. So that I was going to discuss in our next meeting. The nature of consciousness, whether it is connected or isolated, and if it is connected, then how does it affect, and then whether there are pools of consciousness having corresponding to different qualities, and so on. So that is a very interesting subject, interesting aspect of our study. So I was thinking of taking it up in our next meeting, so that we can discuss in details rather than just cursorily going through it.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Kishorji.
Yeah. So welcome. We'll meet in the evening.
Sounds good. Thank you.